Hello everyone, welcome to Midnight Crime Stories. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, and I also know that this might be your first time coming across our channel. So, before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright now, let's get comfortable, relaxed and dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, I'll share with you a story that unfolded in the quiet suburbs of American Fork, Utah. This is a tale of marriage, family, and a conspiracy that would shatter lives forever. Let the words wash over you as we explore what happened on a summer night in 2024. It was Friday, July 12, 2024. The sun had already set over the California desert as Matthew Restelli began what would be his final journey. At 42 years old, Matthew was making the long drive from Temecula, California to American Fork, Utah. He believed he was going to bring his family home. Matthew had been married to Catherine for 7 years. Together they had built a life in Southern California, raising their 3 young children, but for the past 3 weeks, Catherine had been staying at her mother's house in Utah with their children. She had told Matthew she needed a breather, some time away to think. Matthew had been calling her multiple times every day, just as he called his own mother, Diane, with the same frequency. He was a devoted son, a caring father, and despite the troubles in his marriage, he was trying to hold his family together. On that July day, Matthew had made plans to pick up his wife and children. Catherine had told him she couldn't rent a car to drive back to California. She said she had injured her ankle. Matthew, wanting to help and eager to reunite his family, offered to make the drive himself. He would come get them. He even booked a rental car for the return trip so they could all drive back together comfortably. As Matthew's truck rolled through the darkness, covering mile after mile of highway, he stayed in contact with Catherine. She was encouraging, helpful even. She told him which roads to take for the best route. She gave him her mother's address in American Fork. She provided him with the gate code for her mother's gated community. She even asked him to put down cardboard when he parked, so his truck wouldn't leak oil on her mother's driveway. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed like a wife helping her husband find his way to her. What Matthew didn't know was that hidden somewhere in his truck, tucked beneath papers and receipts, and random debris in a storage compartment, was a small device, an Apple AirTag. Someone had been tracking his every movement. As he drove through the night, believing he was heading toward reconciliation, 3 people in American Fork were watching his location on their phones, waiting for him to arrive. Tracy Grist's home sat in a quiet, gated community in American Fork, Utah. At 59 years old, Tracy was Catherine's mother, and for the past 3 weeks her home had been a refuge for her daughter and grandchildren. But something else had been brewing inside those walls, something far darker than simple family support during a marital rough patch. Living at the house with Tracy was her son, Kevin Ellis, Catherine's 33-year-old brother. Kevin had a troubled past. He had accumulated multiple convictions in California between 2007 in 2014, including battery and several DUI. These prior convictions meant he was legally prohibited from possessing firearms. He was what the law called a restricted person. But Kevin did possess a firearm. It was a 9mm semi-automatic handgun that Tracy had purchased from a client back in 2020. That gun was now in the house, waiting. In the days before Matthew's arrival, there had been conversations, text messages, internet searches. While Catherine claimed she wanted a divorce, she had consulted with a lawyer who told her she would need to file in California, where she and Matthew lived. She couldn't just take the children to Utah and file there. The legal reality was complicated, and it seemed to leave her feeling trapped, helpless about what to do next. Tracy, according to text messages police would later recover, had brought up an idea more than once. She or Kevin could kill Matthew. They would use a gun, she said, and put a knife in his hand to sell a story of self-defense. The plan began to take shape. In June, before Matthew's final drive, Tracy had been conducting internet searches. Police would later discover she had looked up gun laws in Utah. She had researched recent shootings in the state, and then there were the more disturbing searches. She looked up the name Daniel Markle, a Florida law professor who had been murdered in 2014 in a notorious murder-for-hire plot, orchestrated by his former in-laws during a bitter custody dispute. She also searched for Catherine Magbonia and Donna Adelson, two of the people convicted in that conspiracy. The parallels were chilling. Catherine had her own searches. On her devices, investigators found she had been researching spousal homicide cases. She had also looked up an odd query: what attracts mountain lions to humans? And then there was the knife. In April, months before Matthew's death, Tracy had traveled to California to help a friend with estate planning after the friend's husband had passed away. During that trip, Tracy had access to tactical gear that the deceased man had collected through a subscription service. Among those items was an Evatac brand knife. Police would later find an email from Tracy's phone, dated April 10, 2024, asking the tactical subscription company to stop sending boxes to the deceased man's address. That same type of knife would later be found at the scene of Matthew's death, placed in his hand. At approximately 10:06 in the evening on July 12th, a neighbor's security camera captured Matthew Rastelli's truck pulling up to Tracy Grist's home in American Fork. Matthew had driven for hours, believing he was about to see his wife and children, believing they would soon be heading home together. Catherine had told him the door would be unlocked. She had told him to just come in when he arrived. And so, trusting the woman he had married, Matthew approached the front door. Tracy had even removed the fabric screen door earlier that day, making it easier for Matthew to enter. She had moved toys from their usual location in the front room. She had covered the living room couch, perhaps anticipating what was to come. Matthew walked through that unlocked door. He stepped into the entryway near the stairs. He called out, perhaps expecting to see his children. At 10:07, just 1 minute after his truck was captured on camera arriving, witnesses nearby heard gunshots. Not just one or two, but multiple shots fired in rapid succession. Kevin Ellis had been waiting. According to what police would later piece together, Kevin shot Matthew multiple times. Shell casings, 8 of them, would be found scattered in the living room near the front door and in the hallway where Matthew fell. Matthew was hit 6, possibly 7 times. 1 bullet struck him in the chest, 2 more struck him in the back. Another hit his right wrist, causing devastating damage, with both an entry and exit wound. Upstairs in a bedroom, Catherine waited with her children. Later she would tell investigators she overheard her brother tell their mother to be careful because Matthew might still be moving. Matthew Rastelli, a left-handed man, collapsed near the stairs in the entryway of his mother-in-law's home. He would never see his children again. He would never complete the drive back to California. His life ended there, on a floor in Utah, in a house he had never visited before. After the shots rang out at 10:07, something peculiar happened. There was silence. The house fell still. Minutes ticked by. Matthew lay on the floor, his life draining away. It wasn't until 10:25 in the evening, a full 18 minutes after the shooting, that someone finally called 911. When emergency responders arrived, they found Matthew Rastelli face down, deceased, and there was something odd about the scene. In Matthew's right hand was a knife. The blade was facing inward, toward his body, not outward as it would be if he had been threatening someone. Matthew was left-handed, yet the knife was placed in his right hand, and that right hand had a devastating gunshot wound that had shattered his wrist, making it virtually impossible for him to have been gripping anything when he was shot. Police immediately noticed these inconsistencies. Detective Joseph Norden, who responded to the scene, later testified that it appeared the knife had been placed in Matthew's hand after he was already dead. Detectives believed that critical 2-minute gap between the shooting and the call to police was used to stage the scene, to create the appearance that Kevin Ellis had acted in self-defense against an armed intruder. When Kevin Ellis was questioned that night in the presence of his attorney, he claimed that Matthew had entered the house without permission, that he had taken Kevin and Tracy by surprise, that Matthew was agitated and carrying a knife. The attorney stated that Kevin feared for his life and shot in self-defense, but there were problems with this story. First, Tracy had told police she knew Matthew was coming. She knew he would arrive a little after 10 in the evening. Catherine certainly knew, as she had been guiding him there all day. This was not a surprise visit by an unwelcome intruder. Second, if Matthew had truly burst into the house wielding a knife, forcing Kevin to run to the garage to retrieve a gun from a safe, Matthew would have had time to penetrate deeper into the house. Instead, he was found just inside the entrance, suggesting he was ambushed almost immediately upon entering. Third, the knife itself was suspicious. Police found no record of Matthew ever purchasing an Eva-Tac knife, but they did trace the knife back to Tracy's trip to California, where she had access to exactly that type of tactical knife. Kevin Ellis was arrested that night and charged with murder. Police seized the phones of Kevin, Tracy, and Catherine, but the investigation was only beginning. What they would find in those devices would reveal a conspiracy far more extensive than anyone initially imagined. In the days and weeks following Matthew's death, American Fork police detectives conducted what they would later describe as an intensive, time-consuming, and meticulous investigation. They combed through text messages, emails, internet search histories, and location data. What emerged was a picture of a carefully planned ambush. In May of 2024, 2 months before Matthew's death, Catherine had sent a text message to a friend. The message was chilling in its casualness. She wrote that she was trying to wait, but might murder Matt that day. At the time, it might have seemed like an exaggerated expression of frustration, but in hindsight, it appeared to be something far more sinister. The AirTag found hidden in Matthew's truck revealed another layer of the conspiracy. Police discovered that Catherine, Tracy, and Kevin all had access to this tracking device. They could all monitor Matthew's location in real time. Text messages showed they were tracking his movements and discussing his whereabouts in the minutes before he arrived at the house. Catherine's sister had even sent her screenshots from Apple Maps showing a blue dot in Aguanga, California, near Matthew's residence, demonstrating they were monitoring him from afar. The planning became even more evident when investigators reviewed the conversations between Catherine and Tracy. After Catherine consulted with a divorce attorney who told her she would need to return to California to file for divorce, the two women began working on a plan to keep her from having to go back. Tracy suggested Catherine fake a sprained ankle as a reason she couldn't rent a car. Text messages showed them discussing ways to avoid renting a vehicle in American Fork, all designed to get Matthew to make the drive to Utah instead. When investigators reviewed Catherine's communications with Matthew during his final drive, they found she had been the perfect conspirator. She never once told him not to come. She never said she didn't want to return to California. Instead, she helped him plan the best route. She provided the gate code. She made sure everything was ready for his arrival. She even recorded phone calls with Matthew on her iPad, ensuring he understood he should just walk into her mother's house when he got there. On the morning of July 12th, hours before Matthew would be killed, Catherine posted a message in a social media chat room. She wrote that she had to do big girl things that morning. The meaning of those words would become clear only in retrospect. The day after Matthew was killed, Catherine told a friend that her husband was dead. The friend expressed condolences, but what happened next was disturbing. While on a video call with this friend, Catherine displayed an image of blood where Matthew's body had been found. She then let her friend speak to Tracy. During that conversation, Tracy told the friend that she would have taken a picture of Matthew's body if she had known the friend liked true crime. 3 days after the shooting, on July 15th, the same friend filed a report with police about Catherine's earlier text message stating she might murder her husband. When Tracy called Matthew's mother Diane to inform her that her son was dead, Diane didn't learn any details about how he died. She had to find out from news reports that her son had been killed by Kevin Ellis. In a phone call that was later recorded and played in court, Diane confronted Tracy. Diane said that the whole thing felt like a setup. Tracy, in that conversation, described her son Kevin as gentle, kind, and sweet, insisting he had only acted in self-defense. But Diane Restelli knew her son. She knew he had been a caring, devoted father and son. She knew he called her multiple times every day. She knew that his last conversation with her had been just 2 hours before he arrived at that house in American Fork. The idea that he had burst in as an armed, aggressive intruder made no sense to her. In the upstairs bedroom where Catherine and the children had waited during the shooting, police found something else. Matthew had been shot and killed directly beneath the room where his own children slept. They were in the house when their father was murdered, just feet away, separated only by a floor and ceiling. Kevin Ellis was arrested on the night of the shooting, but it would be months before the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Investigators continued building their case, following every digital breadcrumb, every phone record, every witness statement. On October 29, 2024, more than 3 months after Matthew's death, American Fork police arrested Catherine Restelli and Tracy Grist. Both women were charged with conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and 2 counts of domestic violence in the presence of a child. The American Fork Police Department announced that their investigation led them to believe the 2 women had worked together with Kevin Ellis to lure Matthew from California so that Kevin could kill him. As Lieutenant Samantha Wasson of the American Fork Police would later note, it was rare to have a murder in their city, let alone one where someone was lured from another state specifically to be killed. The evidence against all 3 was substantial. Kevin had tested positive for cocaine after his arrest, and police found drug paraphernalia in his bedroom, including a rolled-up dollar bill with cocaine residue. His history of convictions and his status as a restricted person made his possession of the murder weapon an additional felony. Tracy's internet searches about the Marco case, gun laws, and custody issues painted a picture of someone researching how to get away with murder, and Catherine's texts, her cooperation in luring Matthew to the house, her fake ankle injury, and her complete lack of warning to Matthew about what awaited him all pointed to active participation in the conspiracy. All 3 remained in jail without the option to post bail as they awaited their trials. On July 17, 2025, nearly a year after Matthew's death, Catherine Restelli stood in a courtroom in Provo, Utah. She pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and felony discharge of a firearm. In exchange, prosecutors dismissed charges of obstruction of justice and 2 counts of domestic violence in the presence of a child. They also agreed not to file perjury charges against her for statements she had made at Kevin Ellis's bail hearing. In her plea statement, Catherine admitted everything. She admitted to leaving her husband on June 20, 2024, taking their children to her mother's house because of marital issues. She admitted that her mother on more than one occasion brought up that she or Kevin would kill Matthew. Tracy had told her they would use a gun and put a knife in Matthew's hand to sell a story of self-defense. Catherine admitted that when she learned Matthew wanted to come get her and the children, she led him to believe she was open to coming back, even though she had no intention of returning. She admitted to placing the tracking device in his truck. She admitted to staying in touch with him throughout his drive, reassuring him that all was well, keeping him calm and unsuspecting. She admitted she knew her brother and mother had lunch together on July 12th to finalize their plans to kill her husband. She admitted her mother removed the screen door, moved toys, and covered furniture to prepare for the murder. And she admitted that she stayed upstairs in a bedroom while Kevin shot Matthew, and that she overheard Kevin tell Tracy to be careful because Matthew might still be moving. She admitted to witnessing the aftermath, the staging, the lie. As part of the plea deal, prosecutors recommended that Catherine serve at least 6 years in prison, though her sentence could extend to life depending on the parole board's decisions. Her cooperation meant she would testify against her mother and brother at their upcoming trials. On September 9, 2025, Catherine Restelli returned to court for sentencing. The courtroom was filled with Matthew's family, people who had loved him and were now left to pick up the pieces of shattered lives. Diane Restelli, Matthew's mother, stood before the judge and addressed her former daughter-in-law. Her words were heavy with grief. She spoke about how Matthew used to call her multiple times a day, how his death had created a massive hole in her heart that would never heal. She told Catherine that someday she hoped Catherine would understand the depth of her actions, but that understanding would never bring Matt back. She said Catherine had stripped her of her son's presence, that Matt's children would never know their incredible father as they grew into adulthood. Matthew's brothers Paul and Mark also spoke. Mark Restelli shared a painful memory. He said he regretted not speaking to his brother after a Father's Day barbecue in 2022. Mark admitted he had not been comfortable with Catherine, and that's why he hadn't invited Matthew and his family to another gathering. He said Matthew had been loyal to Catherine over everyone else in his hiss, even his own brothers. Catherine had him trapped, he said, injecting venom. Mark revealed that he and his wife were now raising Matthew's children along with their own, trying to give them the love and stability their father would have provided. When Catherine's turn came to speak, she cried. She said she was deeply sorry for the pain she had caused, that she understood her apology would never be enough to heal the hurt. She said Matthew didn't deserve what happened, and if she had the power to bring him back, she would. She claimed she had wanted to back out of the conspiracy, but the judge would later say he didn't believe her, noting she had days to stop the plan and chose not to. 4th District Judge Roger Griffin was not sympathetic. He sentenced Catherine Restelli to 1 to 15 years in prison for each of the murder and conspiracy charges, and 5 years to life for the felony discharge of a firearm. The murder and firearm sentences would run consecutively, meaning she would serve at least 6 years before being eligible for parole. But more than the prison time, the judge's words cut deep. Judge Griffin told Catherine that her selfish actions showed she didn't love her children at all. He said she made them victims, lifetime victims of her actions. He issued a protective order forbidding Catherine from ever contacting her children. He said they deserved to grow up without her in their lives. The children who had been upstairs that night, who had lost their father to violence, orchestrated by their own mother, would now be raised by Matthew's family, the people who truly loved them. As Catherine Restelli began her prison sentence, her mother and brother prepared for their own days in court. Tracy Grist was scheduled for trial in January of 2026. Kevin Ellis would follow in February. Both faced charges of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice. Kevin also faced additional charges related to drug possession and illegal gun possession. Catherine was expected to testify against both of them, her cooperation part of the deal she made to reduce her own charges. The question remained whether a jury would believe that Kevin had knowingly participated in the conspiracy or if, as his attorney argued, he had been used by his mother without fully understanding the plan. The evidence would be presented, witness testimony heard, and 12 citizens would decide. But for the Restelli family, no verdict would bring Matthew back. No prison sentence would restore the daily phone calls Diane cherished. No courtroom proceeding would return a father to 3 young children, who would now grow up with memories fading and questions that could never be fully answered. Matthew's family vowed to be strong. Diane said they would do what Matthew would have done, caring for his children with love and dedication. She said she was certain Matthew was pleased that they were raising his children during these unspeakable times, because they loved them, cherished them, and respected the meaning of family. The murder of Matthew Restelli is a story about trust betrayed in the most profound way possible. A man believed his wife when she said she needed space. He trusted her when she asked him to drive across state lines to bring his family home. He walked through an unlocked door believing he was taking the first step toward reconciliation. Instead, he walked into an ambush planned by the people who should have been his family through marriage. His wife lured him, his mother-in-law prepared the scene, his brother-in-law pulled the trigger, and all the while his children waited upstairs, innocent victims of a conspiracy born from frustration, desperation, and a complete disregard for human life. The case bears haunting similarities to the murder of Daniel Marco, the Florida law professor killed in a murder-for-hire plot, orchestrated by his former in-laws during a custody dispute. That case, which Tracy Grist had researched online, showed the lengths some families will go to maintain control, to avoid the messy realities of divorce and custody battles. The parallels were not lost on investigators or prosecutors. In the end, 3 people made a choice. They chose murder over divorce proceedings. They chose violence over legal remedies. They chose to take a father from his children, rather than navigate the difficult but lawful process of ending a marriage. And now they would spend years, perhaps the rest of their lives, behind bars for that choice. Matthew Restelli was 42 years old when he died. He was a devoted son who called his mother multiple times every day. He was a father who cared deeply for his 3 children. He was a man trying to save his marriage, trying to keep his family together. His last conversation with his mother was just 2 hours before he arrived at that house in American Fork. He never made it home. But his children will. They will grow up knowing their father loved them, knowing their grandparents and uncles are raising them with the same devotion Matthew showed. They will grow up understanding that, while evil touched their lives that terrible night in July, love and family survived. So if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Midnight Crime Stories, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. This story is one of tragedy, but told gently, with a pace meant to carry you peacefully towards sleep. This is the story of Jonathan Amirolo, a young man whose life was taken far too soon, in the early autumn of 2020 among the quiet forests of New Hampshire. Sometimes the most peaceful places hide the darkest secrets, and sometimes the kindest souls encounter the cruelest fates. Jonathan Emerl was born on January 27, 1995, in the small mountain town of Rangeley, Maine. When he was just 5 years old, his family moved to Milford, New Hampshire, a town of about 15,000 people nestled in the southern part of the state. It was here, in Milford, that Jonathan would grow up, finding his passions and building the foundation of the person he would become. From an early age, Jonathan was driven, not in a loud or boastful way, but with a quiet determination that impressed everyone who knew him. In high school, he became captain of not one, but 3 teams: indoor track, outdoor track, and cross country. Picture him there, running through the New Hampshire woods, his feet striking the earth in steady rhythm, mile after mile, always pushing himself to be better. But Jonathan's dedication extended far beyond athletics. He discovered the Souhegan Valley Boys and Girls Club when he was young, and it became a second home to him. As soon as he finished his runs after school, he would head straight to the club to volunteer. He gave so much of his time, so much of himself, that he logged over 700 hours of service. In 2010, when he was just 15 years old, Jonathan was named Youth Volunteer of the Year. He didn't even know such an award existed. The recognition didn't stop there. His dedication earned him 2 Presidential White House Youth Service Awards, one from President Bush and another from President Obama. For a teenager from a small New Hampshire town, these were extraordinary achievements. His volunteer work caught the attention of a recruiter from the Rochester Institute of Technology. Jonathan was accepted with a scholarship. In 2018, he graduated cum laude with a Bachelor of Science degree in biomedical engineering. He was 23 years old, and the world seemed wide open before him. Jonathan quickly found work at Teleflex, a biomedical device manufacturing company in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, working as a manufacturing engineer. His colleagues would later describe him as someone who wouldn't hurt a fly, someone happy and talented and always encouraging others to improve. He had a way of pushing people outside their comfort zones, always saying, "You did great, now this is how we improve it, and do even more next time." But work wasn't Jonathan's only passion. He was an avid hiker, deeply in love with the mountains of northern New England. He set himself a challenge to summit all 67 mountains in the region that stand over 4,000 feet tall. By September of 2020, he had climbed 66 of them. Just one mountain remained. Jonathan had recently bought his own house in Keene, New Hampshire. At 25 years old, he was building a life, building a future. He shared his hiking adventures on social media, offering advice and stories to the outdoor community. He had so many friends who admired him, who looked up to him, who called him their brother. One of those friends called him his best man. Another friend would say Jonathan was the person you could count on to pick up the phone, whether it was a 3 a.m. work call to fix a problem, or a weekend spent planning the next hiking adventure. Jonathan was reliable. Jonathan was kind. Jonathan was good. And that, perhaps, was his greatest tragedy. Because in September of 2020, Jonathan's kindness would lead him into the darkest night of his life. In that same small corner of New Hampshire, there lived a married couple, Armando and Brittany Barron. They had married young teenagers really, and together they had 3 daughters. From the outside, they might have looked like any other family in Jaffrey, a town of about 5,000 people just a few miles from where Jonathan worked. But behind closed doors their marriage was troubled. Brittany would later testify that she had been living in fear for years, trapped in a relationship marked by control and violence. She wanted out. She wanted a divorce, but she was afraid of what her husband might do. Brittany worked at Teleflex, the same biomedical company where Jonathan worked. She was a machine operator, and in the late summer of 2020, she and Jonathan were assigned to work on the same project. They spent time together during those days, talking during breaks. getting to know each other. Jonathan was kind to her. He was funny and sweet and encouraging. They began texting, messaging each other on Snapchat, sharing conversations that grew warmer with each passing day. Brittany told Jonathan that she wanted a divorce from her husband. She told him she wasn't looking for a relationship right away, but that she was willing to be friends, to get to know him better. They met at a park one afternoon after work and talked. Before she left, she gave him a quick kiss. It was brief, innocent perhaps, but meaningful. The next day, during a work break, they kissed again. This was just one day before everything would change. Brittany was careful. She would log out of her phone, trying to hide her messages from Armando. I didn't want Armando to see that I was talking to a guy, she would later testify. But no matter how careful she was, it wasn't enough. On the night of September 19, 2020, about a week after Brittany had told Armando she wanted a divorce, he went through her phone. He found the messages between her and Jonathan. He found the conversations, the warmth, the connection, and something inside him snapped. What happened next in the early morning hours between September 19th and September 20th would be described by prosecutors as brutal, horrific, and completely senseless. But for now, let's take this slowly, gently, as we move through the darkness of that night. When Armando discovered the messages, he became enraged. He grabbed Brittany and began to beat her. He choked her until she lost consciousness. When she came to, she thought she was going to die. He punched her repeatedly in the face, breaking her nose. He took a gun and shoved it into her mouth with such force that he chipped one of her teeth. "You know that you're going to die tonight, right?" he told her. He made her read the messages aloud, every single one. After each message, he would hit her again. He told her, "Don't do anything stupid or the girls are going to walk into something gruesome." He sent their 3 young daughters next door to their grandmother's house. Then he forced Brittany into their Jeep Patriot. Armando took Brittany's phone and began to type. He pretended to be her, sending messages to Jonathan. "Can you meet me?" the messages said. He lured Jonathan to Annette Wayside Park, a small peaceful park in Renge, New Hampshire, part of a larger state forest that covered nearly 1,500 acres. Annette Wayside Park was beautiful in the daytime, a quiet spot for picnicking with a quarter-mile hiking trail leading to the edge of Black Reservoir. But at night, especially in late September, it was isolated and dark. The gates were open, but the park was unstaffed. No one would be there to help. No one would hear anything. Jonathan arrived at the park, thinking he was meeting Brittany. Perhaps he was concerned about her. Perhaps he wanted to make sure she was safe. Instead, he found both Brittany and Armando waiting for him. What happened next was a nightmare. Armando attacked Jonathan immediately. He beat him with his fists and kicked him repeatedly. Jonathan, who had spent years running and hiking, who was strong and fit, tried to defend himself, but Armando was relentless, driven by a jealous rage that consumed all reason. The medical examiner would later testify that Jonathan had defensive wounds on his arms and hands, evidence that he tried to protect himself. There were bruises on his forehead and cheek in a zigzag pattern that looked very much like footwear impressions. Armando had stomped on him. Armando forced Brittany to participate. He ordered her to stand on Jonathan's neck. He told her to cut Jonathan's wrists. Terrified, knowing that her own life hung in the balance, she complied, though she would later say she didn't apply pressure to his neck as Armando demanded. Then Armando pulled out a gun. He placed it in Brittany's hand and ordered her to shoot Jonathan. She refused. She could not do it. Even under threat of death, even with everything she had already endured that night, she could not take Jonathan's life. She lowered the gun. She said no. Armando forced Jonathan into the back seat of Jonathan's own car, a Subaru. He ordered Brittany to get into the driver's seat. For a moment, Armando stepped away, leaving them alone. Brittany would later testify that Jonathan begged for his life during those minutes. He pleaded. He was afraid. Then Armando got into the back seat with Jonathan. Brittany heard him move. She heard him turn. And then she heard 3 gunshots. 3 times, Armando fired his gun. Twice into Jonathan's chest. Once into his head. Jonathan Amarillo, 25 years old, was dead. In the darkness of that September night, with Jonathan's body still in the back seat, Armando gave Brittany her orders. She was to drive Jonathan's car north. He would follow behind her in their Jeep. She was to drive for hours, all the way to a remote campsite in Coos County, in the far northern reaches of New Hampshire, 200 miles away. Brittany drove through the night. Armando stayed on the phone with her almost the entire time, talking to her, watching her, making sure she didn't try to run or call for help. She drove through small towns and long stretches of forest. Jonathan's body behind her, the weight of what had happened pressing down on her with every mile. They arrived at a campsite in an unincorporated area called Atkinson and Gilmanton Academy Grant, deep in the woods of Coos County. It was remote, isolated, the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another person. It was where Armando intended to dispose of Jonathan's body in a way that would make identification difficult. He forced Brittany to do unspeakable things. He told her they needed to remove Jonathan's head, so there would be no dental records, no easy way for authorities to identify the body. He gave her a saw that had been left at the campsite. She used the saw and a smaller blade to complete the horrific task. She wrapped Jonathan's head and buried it. She wrapped his body in a tarp and covered it with branches. Armando went to buy a shovel from a nearby store and groceries from the IGA in Colebrook. Then he left Brittany alone at the campsite, telling her to finish disposing of the body. He drove home. Brittany stayed there, alone in the woods, with what remained of Jonathan. She stayed with him for days. On Monday, September 21st, Jonathan didn't show up for work at Teleflex. His colleagues were worried. This wasn't like him. Jonathan was reliable, always there, always on time. His mother reported him missing to the police. Investigators began looking into Jonathan's disappearance. They learned that Brittany Barron, who also worked at Teleflex, had called in that day to say she was quitting. They learned that co-workers believed Jonathan and Brittany had been involved in some kind of relationship. They traced Jonathan's phone records and found calls to Brittany's residence and to Teleflex. The search widened. Friends drove around looking for any sign of him. They walked through woods hoping to find some clue. David Dupree Wilson, one of Jonathan's closest friends, kept everyone updated on social media as they searched desperately for their missing friend. Then on Tuesday, September 22nd, Fish and Game officers were investigating a report of someone camping illegally in the remote northern woods of Coos County. They heard a dog barking. As they approached the campsite, they found Brittany Barron trying to quiet the animal. She had a pistol in a pouch on her midsection. The officers also found a large brown tarp covered with branches. When they moved the branches, they discovered it was covering a portion of Jonathan Amarillo's body. On Wednesday, September 23rd, an autopsy was conducted. The chief medical examiner determined that Jonathan had died from gunshot wounds to the head, and the manner of death was homicide. On Thursday, September 24th, Brittany Barron was arrested and charged with 3 counts of falsifying physical evidence. On Friday, September 25th, Armando Barron was arrested and charged with capital murder for knowingly causing the death of Jonathan Amarillo by shooting him while engaged in the commission of a kidnapping. The trial didn't take place until May of 2022, nearly 2 years after Jonathan's death. By then, Brittany had accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to 3 counts of falsifying evidence. She was sentenced to time served and released on parole in April of 2022. She agreed to testify against her husband. In the courtroom in Keene, New Hampshire, Brittany took the stand and recounted the horror of that night. She described the beatings, the gun in her mouth, the threats to her life and the lives of her daughters. She described how Armando had used her phone to lure Jonathan to the park, how he had beaten Jonathan mercilessly, how he had forced her to participate in the torture. She told the jury that she had refused to shoot Jonathan, even when Armando placed the gun in her hand. She described hearing the 3 gunshots as Armando killed Jonathan in the back seat of his own car. She described the long drive north, the phone calls throughout the night, the horror of what she was forced to do at the campsite. Armando's defense attorneys tried to suggest that Brittany was the real killer, that she was capable of lying, that her testimony should not be trusted. But the evidence told a different story. The medical examiner testified about Jonathan's injuries, the defensive wounds, the footwear impressions, the gunshots. Prosecutors presented evidence that Armando had all the motive in the world to kill Jonathan. The defendant had all the motive to kill Jonathan, prosecutor Benjamin Agati told the jury, because for him Jonathan was a man who had just started seeing his wife. On Thursday, May 26, 2022, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury returned their verdict. Armando Barron was found guilty on all 13 charges, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, criminal solicitation of murder, assault, domestic violence, and reckless conduct. Jonathan's mother was in the courtroom. When the verdict was read, she began to cry. The next day, Armando Barron was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 45 years on the other charges. Judge Elizabeth Leonard addressed him directly at the sentencing hearing. The depravity of your actions in single-handedly causing the pain and suffering and death of Jonathan Emerlo show an extreme indifference to the value of human life, she said. Your actions were brutal. They were absolutely horrific, they were selfish, and they were completely senseless. Jonathan's family spoke at the sentencing hearing, their grief raw and overwhelming. His mother, Justine, could barely look at Armando Barron. She told the court that the last hours of Jonathan's beautiful life were spent in the company of what she called an ugly, hideous, demented creature. Jonathan's father, Kenny Emerl, called Armando a coward. You had to ambush and attack John with knives, a machete and guns just to take him down, he said. A wife beater, disgusting, despicable. The loss of Jonathan rippled through the entire community. His co-workers at Teleflex were devastated. One of them wrote in a victim impact statement that they had worked closely with Jonathan for about 2 years, that he was one of the best people they had ever known, that they had looked up to him and admired how accomplished he was at such a young age. He was such a happy-go-lucky guy who wouldn't hurt a fly, the co-worker wrote. When I saw he went missing, my heart sunk, and he was the only thing on my mind. Another friend wrote about how Jonathan was always there, always reliable, whether it was a 3 a.m. work call or a weekend hiking adventure. If you had John as a friend, you always had a cheerleader in your corner. In July of 2021, the Souhegan Valley Boys and Girls Club in Milford held a dedication ceremony for Jonathan. They unveiled a granite bench inscribed with a tribute to him, along with the club's mission statement. They also revealed a mural with the words "Be Great," which Jonathan had worked on with kids at the club. Jonathan's mother, Justine, wrote a story about her son's life that was read at the ceremony. She described how Jonathan would run for miles after school, and then run straight to the Boys and Girls Club so he could volunteer. She talked about his service awards from 2 presidents, his scholarship to the Rochester Institute of Technology, his degree in biomedical engineering, his job at Teleflex where he was working to install a new production line. Jonathan was inspired by the Boys and Girls Club to be great, she wrote. In turn, he tried to inspire others to be great. That perhaps is how we should remember Jonathan Amaro, not for the horror of how his life ended, but for the way he lived, for the mountains he climbed, 66 of them, with just one left to conquer, for the 700 hours he gave to help children, for the way he encouraged his friends and co-workers to be better, to do more, to never stand still, for the kindness he showed to everyone, even to someone who would ultimately betray him. In April of 2025, the New Hampshire Supreme Court denied Armando Barron's appeal and upheld his conviction and sentence. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. Jonathan's family continues to grieve. His friends continue to remember him. The outdoor community he loved continues to share his stories and his passion for the mountains of New England. One of Jonathan's friends, David Dupree Wilson, wrote on social media after Jonathan's body was found, "My brother, my best man, has been found. He was murdered and left alone for 4 days. I am disgusted. I am angry and terribly sad. It's been more than 4 years now since that terrible September night in 2020. The park where Jonathan was attacked is still there, still peaceful during the day, still part of the larger Annate State Forest with its 1,500 acres of wood. The campsite in the northern woods is still remote and isolated. The mountains Jonathan loved to climb are still there, standing tall against the New Hampshire sky. But Jonathan is gone. At 25 years old, with so much life ahead of him, with one mountain left to climb, he was taken from this world by an act of senseless violence. His story reminds us that darkness can intrude even into the brightest lives, even in the quietest places. It reminds us that jealousy and rage can destroy not just one life, but many, the ripples spreading outward to touch everyone who loved the person who was lost. And it reminds us that goodness, kindness, and service matter. Jonathan Amaro packed more incredible accomplishments into his 25 years than many people achieve in twice that time. He inspired others to be great. He was a cheerleader in the corner of everyone who knew him. That is his legacy. Remember that even in the darkest stories there is light in how we remember those we've lost, in the good they did while they were here, in the lives they touched and the people they inspired to be better. Please, if you're still with me, let me know in the comments. Tell me the time in your corner of the world, or just say something to show you're still awake. And remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy these midnight stories. Alright, let's continue with our third story. Story 3. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolds slowly, methodically, like the turning of pages in a book you can't quite put down. It's a story about trust and betrayal, about the mask people wear, and the secrets they keep. So close your eyes if you wish, and let me take you to Melbourne, Australia, where on a warm summer evening in January of 2010, a birthday celebration would end in a way no one could have predicted. Chris Soteria seemed to have everything. Born in Cyprus, he had come to Australia as a 12-year-old boy with his family, leaving behind a war-torn homeland for the promise of a better life in Melbourne. The Soteria family settled in Reservoir, a working-class suburb, and young Chris learned early the value of hard work and determination. By the time he reached his 40s, Chris had transformed himself into the embodiment of the Australian dream. He was a successful engineer and businessman, working on prestigious projects including infrastructure for the 2000 Sydney Olympics. His income had grown to $600,000 a year. He drove fast cars, wore designer clothes, and took his family on luxury holidays. But more than the material success, Chris was proud of his family. He had 3 children, including a set of twins, and by all appearances a loving marriage to his wife, Vicky. Vicky Soteria was beautiful, attentive, and seemed devoted to her husband. To their friends and neighbors in the tight-knit Greek-Australian community of Watsonia North, they were the ideal couple. They hosted barbecues, celebrated name days and holidays with extended family, and their home was filled with laughter and the sounds of children playing. Chris believed he had a harmonious marriage. Sure, there were moments when he caught Vicky in small lies, little inconsistencies that didn't quite add up, but what marriage was perfect. He loved her, and he believed she loved him. After all, she told him so, repeatedly. She said she loved him to death. What Chris didn't know was that Vicky had been living a double life for years. Eerie Dimitrakis had known Vicky since 1994. He was a self-employed limousine driver, a man who drifted through life with few anchors. In early 1995, during a time when Vicky felt pressured by family expectations, she had reconnected with Ari, and they began a relationship. But Vicky ultimately chose a different path, marrying Chris Soteria instead. Years passed. Vicky and Chris built their life together, had their children, accumulated wealth, but sometime around 2008, Vicky reconnected with Ari Dimitrakis, and their relationship reignited with an intensity that consumed them both. This wasn't a casual affair. Vicky and Ari met in hotel rooms, exchanged passionate notes, and made promises to each other. Vicky had Ari's name tattooed on her wedding ring finger, hidden beneath her wedding band where Chris would never see it. She had his initials tattooed at her hairline, at the back of her neck. She and Ari even purchased burial plots together, planning for an eternity side by side. They talked about leaving their spouses, about finally being together openly. But Vicky had a problem. She enjoyed the lifestyle that Chris provided, the luxury, the security, the financial comfort. Chris had over $2 million in superannuation alone. If she divorced him, she would be entitled to a portion, perhaps $3 million. But if Chris died while they were still married, she would inherit everything. $7 million. The mathematics of murder had entered Vicky's mind. This wasn't the first time Vicky had considered killing her husband. Years earlier, in 2005, Vicky had been having an affair with another man, Tony Alexowski. One day, at a motel in Preston, she made him an extraordinary proposition. She asked him to kill Chris. She offered him $50,000 in cash. Tony thought she was joking. He laughed it off, uncomfortable but not quite believing she was serious. When he realized she meant it, he refused. Shortly after that conversation, Vicky ended their affair, but the seed had been planted in her mind, and it would grow over the following years until it consumed her completely. On the evening of January 2nd, 2010, Vicky organized a surprise party for Chris's 44th birthday. She booked a table at Alpha Uzeri, a popular Greek restaurant on Brunswick Street in Fitzroy, one of Melbourne's most vibrant neighborhoods. Friends and family gathered to celebrate. There was food, wine, laughter. It was exactly the kind of celebration Chris loved, surrounded by the people who mattered most to him. Throughout the evening, Vicky was attentive and affectionate. She kept promising Chris that the night would end with a special surprise. She was playful, teasing, saying over and over that he was going to get lucky tonight, that she had something wonderful planned. Chris was happy. He had no reason to suspect that anything was wrong. But earlier that day, before the party, Vicky had met Ari Dimitrakis in a park. She handed him something wrapped in a towel. It was a knife, a kitchen knife that Chris himself had given Vicky as a Christmas present years earlier. Vicky looked at Ari and said simply, "See you tonight." Ari took the knife. He later claimed he had taken too many pills that day, that he was in a fog, that he couldn't remember what happened next. But that's not quite true. He knew what he was supposed to do. He knew where to wait. After the party ended, Chris and Vicky walked back toward their car. They were laughing, hugging, reminiscing about what a beautiful evening it had been. Chris felt warm with wine and friendship, completely unsuspecting, his arm around his wife. They turned down a side street in Fitzroy. It was darker there, quieter, and then someone grabbed Chris from behind. He felt hands on his jacket collar pulling him backward. Before he could react, before he could even understand what was happening, he felt something cold against his throat. A blade. It moved across his neck in one swift, deep motion. Then came the stabbing. Once, twice, 3 times, 4, 6, 7 times. The knife plunged into his chest, his torso, his abdomen. Chris would later say that in those moments he felt no pain. His body went into shock. He was aware of what was happening, but it felt surreal, like watching a scene from a movie in which he was somehow the main character. He saw Vicky standing nearby, watching. He didn't understand. Why wasn't she helping? Why wasn't she screaming? The attacker ran off into the night. Chris staggered, his hands going to his throat. Blood was pouring from the wound, hot and fast. His white shirt was turning red. His legs felt weak. And then, by extraordinary chance, 2 off-duty doctors happened to be walking past. They saw Chris, saw the blood, and immediately rushed to help. One of them pressed his hands against Chris's throat, trying to stop the arterial bleeding. The other called for an ambulance. Those 2 doctors in the right place at the right time saved Chris Soteria's life in those crucial first minutes. Without them, he would have bled out on that Fitzroy street before the ambulance could arrive. At the hospital, Chris's condition was catastrophic. He had been stabbed 7 times. His throat had been slashed so deeply that both sides had to be stitched back together. His liver was lacerated and draining. His lungs had to be artificially inflated. He had lost tremendous amounts of blood. The medical team fought to save him. They worked through the night, performing emergency surgery, giving him transfusions, monitoring every vital sign. At several points, Chris nearly died from multiple organ failure. His body was strong, fortunately. He had always been fit, had taken care of himself. That physical resilience made the difference between life and death. The doctors placed Chris in a medically induced coma. He would remain unconscious for 3 weeks, his body given time to begin the long process of healing. During those weeks, his family maintained a vigil at his bedside. His children, his extended family, his friends, everyone except Vicky, who seemed strangely detached from the horror of what had happened. When Chris finally woke from his coma, weak and confused, trying to understand where he was and what had happened, the police were there waiting to speak with him. They had to tell him something that would shatter his world far more completely than the knife wounds had shattered his body. They told him that his wife, Vicky, had been having an affair, that she and her lover, Ari Dimitrakis, had planned the attack, that Vicky had given Ari the knife, that she had insisted on driving Chris to the party herself, making sure she controlled when and where they would leave, that she had arranged everything, orchestrated every detail of what was meant to be her husband's murder. Chris couldn't believe it. He didn't want to believe it. This was the woman he had married 17 years earlier, the mother of his children, his partner in building the life they shared. How could she want him dead? But the evidence was overwhelming. The police had interviewed witnesses, including neighbors who had seen Ari Dimitrakis lurking around the Soteria home for months, acting strangely. One particularly observant neighbor had even taken photographs with dates and times, documenting Dimitrakis' stalking behavior. The police had also interviewed Vicky. In those early interviews, she admitted to the affair but tried to minimize her role. She claimed she hadn't wanted Chris killed, that Ari must have acted on his own, perhaps out of some misguided jealousy. But the evidence told a different story. Cell phone records, text messages, witness statements. The plot had been carefully planned. Ari Dimitrakis was arrested first. He eventually agreed to plead guilty to a lesser charge of intentionally causing serious injury rather than attempted murder. In exchange, he agreed to testify against Vicky. The court heard how Vicky had given him the knife, how she had planned the timing, how she had promised they could finally be together once Chris was gone. At his sentencing, Justice Paul Coughlin described the plot as callous, cold-blooded, and well-planned. Dimitrakis was sentenced to 7 years in prison with a minimum of 5 years to serve. Chris's brother John, sitting in the courtroom, called Dimitrakis a coward and stormed out, outraged at what he felt was too lenient a sentence. But the main trial was yet to come. Vicky Soterio pleaded not guilty. She maintained her innocence throughout the trial, even as evidence mounted against her. The jury heard testimony about the affair, about the tattoos, about the burial plots purchased together. They heard about the 2005 conversation, where Vicky had tried to hire another lover to kill Chris. They heard about the knife, given to Ari hours before the attack. They heard about Vicky's strange behavior at the hospital, her lack of emotion, her seeming detachment. The trial captured national attention in Australia. It had all the elements of a Greek tragedy, as some observers noted. Passion, betrayal, violence, family loyalty tested to its breaking point. Through it all, Chris attended the proceedings, still recovering from his injuries, still trying to understand how the woman he loved could have orchestrated his murder. On October 7, 2011, the jury returned its verdict: guilty. Vicky Soterio was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Chris's family embraced, tears streaming down their faces. Vicky showed little reaction, sitting quietly with her parents beside her. At her sentencing, Justice Elizabeth Curtin spoke directly to Vicky. She told her that while she hadn't wielded the knife herself, she had intended Chris's death just as surely as if she had. She spoke about the profound sense of betrayal Chris must feel, knowing that his wife had tried to have him killed on his 44th birthday, of all days. She noted that Vicky had shown highly manipulative conduct, and that if the plan had succeeded, 3 children would have been left without a father. Vicky Soterio was sentenced to 12 years in prison with a minimum of 9 years before she would be eligible for parole. Outside the courthouse, Chris told reporters he was relieved the trial was over so he could begin to move on. But he also said he still couldn't make sense of the whole tragic event. How could someone he loved, someone he trusted completely, want him dead? While Chris was recovering in the hospital during those early days, Vicky's family had gone to the Soterio home. They removed items worth approximately $100,000. Vicky herself withdrew $200,000 from their bank accounts. When Chris discovered these actions, it added insult to his injuries, both literal and figurative. Chris later sued Vicky for civil damages, seeking compensation for the psychological trauma, the medical costs, and the loss of his ability to work. He testified that the psychological shock was so severe that he could no longer maintain his previous level of professional engagement. The court eventually awarded him $2.4 million in civil damages, but collecting that money proved almost impossible. While Vicky was in prison, her family helped her transfer property assets into their names, attempting to shield the money from Chris's claim. He was forced to take legal action against Vicky's parents and her sister, seeking the money he was owed. The financial and legal battles would continue for years, adding layers of stress to an already devastating situation. Perhaps the most heartbreaking consequence of the crime was its impact on Chris's relationship with his eldest daughter. Before Vicky was convicted, She and her family convinced the girl that Chris had actually orchestrated the attack himself as a way to frame Vicky. They told her that her father was the villain, not her mother. Even after Vicky's conviction, even after all the evidence had been presented in court, Chris's daughter continued to believe that her mother was innocent and her father was to blame. She refused to speak to Chris. The relationship was severed, and Chris could do nothing but hope that someday, somehow, she would see the truth. In an interview years later, Chris spoke about this estrangement with visible emotion. He said he hoped his daughter was okay, that his door would always be open to her, and that he wanted her to know his version of events was the truth. But he couldn't force her to listen. He couldn't force her to forgive him for something he hadn't done. Despite everything, Chris Soteria worked to rebuild his life. He focused on his younger children, especially his twins, walking them to and from school every day. He found love again with a new partner, someone he described as a strong, spiritual, balanced person, a beautiful soul. He also channeled his experience into helping other crime victims navigate the legal system. He established the Powerhouse Retreat, a facility designed to support victims and their families during lengthy court proceedings, providing them with accommodation and guidance through one of the most difficult periods of their lives. Chris told interviewers that he wanted to make sure other people didn't go through what he had gone through with the legal system after such an ordeal. His own experience had taught him how vulnerable and lost victims can feel when thrust into the criminal justice process. He wanted to create something that would make that journey a little less lonely for others. In interviews, Chris spoke about the importance of forgiveness, not for Vicky's sake but for his own peace of mind. He said, "You never forget what happened, but you have to forgive and move on. Life is a journey with its ups and downs." He had sunk to the lowest level but had risen again, and life was now beautiful. New partner, new lifestyle, new purpose. In early 2022, after serving 10 years of her 12-year sentence, Vicky Soteria was quietly released from the Dame Phyllis Frost Maximum Security Correctional Center. She had served her time largely without incident, and was released with various restrictions placed on her movements and activities. She returned to life in Melbourne's northern suburbs, living with family members, trying to rebuild a life far different from the one she had known before. Eerie Dimitrakis had been released even earlier, having served 7 years. Chris was notified of Vicky's impending release weeks before it happened. He opposed the decision but ultimately had no power to prevent it. When asked about it by reporters, he declined to comment extensively, but his previous words echoed, "Life is a journey. You have to forgive and move on." And so the story of Chris Soteria comes to its conclusion. Though perhaps it's a story that has no real ending. The physical wounds healed, leaving scars that Chris would carry for the rest of his life. The emotional and psychological wounds run deeper still, visible in different ways: the loss of trust, the shattering of the belief that he knew the person he had married, the estrangement from his daughter, the years of legal battles and financial stress. But there's also resilience in this story. The remarkable fact of Chris's survival, the result of chance, the presence of those 2 doctors at exactly the right moment, the strength he found to rebuild his life, to love again, to help others, the determination to be present for his children, to find meaning in the aftermath of trauma. What makes someone capable of planning the murder of their spouse? What combination of greed, obsession, and moral detachment allows a person to hand a knife to their lover and say, "See you tonight," knowing that by night's end the father of their children might be dead? These are questions that haunted Chris, and they're questions without satisfying answers. Vicky never fully explained her actions beyond saying they were stupid and silly, words that seem grotesquely inadequate for the magnitude of what she planned and nearly succeeded in carrying out. The case reminds us that we can never fully know another person, no matter how long we've lived beside them, shared meals with them, raised children with them. People carry secrets, sometimes dark and terrible ones. They construct facades that can last years, even decades. And sometimes those facades slip, and the person underneath is unrecognizable. And so we leave Chris Soteria, in Melbourne, living his rebuilt life, carrying his scars both visible and invisible, walking his children to school, loving his new partner, helping other crime victims find their way through the darkness he once walked through himself. His story is one of survival against extraordinary odds, of the random chance that placed two doctors on a Fitzroy street at exactly the moment they were needed, of the strength required to wake from a coma and learn that your entire life was built on a foundation of lies, of the courage needed to face your attacker and your betrayer in a courtroom, and then somehow move forward into an uncertain future. It's late now. The story is told. Let yourself rest. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Whatever darkness exists in the world, whatever capacity for betrayal and violence humans carry within them, there's also resilience, kindness, the presence of those two doctors who didn't turn away, the friend who takes photographs that become evidence, the justice system that, however imperfectly, seeks to assign responsibility and consequence. Please, if you haven't drifted off yet, check in with me. Tell me which story has been the most chilling so far, the first, the second, or the third. And if you're enjoying these stories, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Now, let's move on to story number 4. Story 4. Tonight we're going to explore a case that reminds us how the search for connection in our modern world can sometimes lead down unexpected paths. This is the story of Nikki McFadder, a young woman whose life was cut short in the spring of 2009. Let your breathing slow. This story unfolds at a gentle pace. We'll move through the details of what happened on those fateful days in May. Charlotte, North Carolina, in the late 2000s, was a city of constant motion. At Charlotte Douglas International Airport, thousands of travelers passed through the terminals each day, their journeys facilitated by the airline employees working behind the ticket counters. Among these workers was Nikki McFadder. She was 30 years old in 2009, a woman who had always known what she wanted from life and how to pursue it. Those who knew her described her as goal-oriented, someone who moved through the world with purpose and determination. Nikki's journey had begun in September of 1978. After graduating from high school, she made a choice that would shape her early adult years. She joined the United States Navy, following a path of service that took her away from civilian life and into the structured world of military duty. It was a significant commitment, one that spoke to her character and her willingness to challenge herself. When her time in the Navy came to an end, Nikki returned to civilian life with that same sense of direction. She found work with U.S. Airways as a ticketing agent at Charlotte Douglas International Airport. It was steady work, professional work, the kind of position where she could interact with people from all walks of life as they passed through the airport on their way to destinations unknown. But Nikki wasn't all business. According to her older sister Latoya, who lived outside of Raleigh, Nikki had an adventurous spirit. She loved skydiving. Imagine that for a moment. The thrill of stepping out into open air, the rush of free fall, the controlled descent back to earth. It was the kind of hobby that suggested someone who wasn't afraid of taking chances, who understood both risk and the importance of preparation. Yet for all her accomplishments, Nikki found herself single and searching. In 2009, that search increasingly took place online, where dating websites promised to help people find connection in an increasingly digital world. It was through one such site, called Tag.com, that Nikki's path would intersect with a man who would forever alter the course of her life. His name was Theodore Roosevelt Manning IV. Those who knew him called him Teddy. Like Nikki, he was 30 years old. Like Nikki, he was a veteran, having served in the United States Air Force before transitioning to civilian work. He held a job at a power plant in Columbia, South Carolina, about 90 miles south of Charlotte. On paper, on a dating website profile, Teddy Manning might have seemed like a reasonable match. Similar age, military background, employed, the kind of basic compatibility that dating algorithms are designed to identify. But profiles on dating websites, as we know, tell only part of the story. They show us what someone wants us to see, the curated version of themselves they present to the world. The reality is often more complicated. Teddy Manning was charming. He was by accounts handsome and soft-spoken, but he was also someone with secrets, with complexities that wouldn't be immediately apparent to someone scrolling through his profile photos and reading his carefully crafted bio. Nikki and Teddy began talking online in February of 2009. Eventually, their communication moved from the digital realm to the physical world. They began dating. Since Teddy lived in Columbia and Nikki lived in Charlotte, it fell to Nikki to make the drive south on weekends when she wanted to see him. 90 miles each way. Not an impossible distance, but not insignificant either. For about 3 months, this pattern continued. Nikki would make the drive to Columbia. They would spend time together. She would return to Charlotte to her job, her friends, her life. But as the weeks passed, Nikki began to notice things that troubled her. Teddy's behavior suggested that he wasn't interested in the kind of relationship Nikki was seeking. He wanted something casual, something without commitment. More concerning, it became clear that Nikki wasn't the only woman in his life. Teddy was dating multiple women simultaneously. He would later admit to investigators that he was involved with 6 different women at the same time. For Nikki, who had been searching for genuine connection, this was disappointing. She had invested time and emotional energy into this relationship, making those drives back and forth, hoping for something more substantial to develop. But Teddy's actions made it clear that he had different intentions. By early May of 2009, Nikki had reached a decision. She confided in her sister Latoya that she was planning to end the relationship. But there was a practical matter to address first. She had given Teddy some of her jewelry to have repaired, and she wanted it back before severing ties completely. On May 6, 2009, Nikki made what would be her final drive to Columbia. The morning of May 6th began ordinarily enough for Nikki McFadder. She got into her black 2003 Honda Accord, the one with the North Carolina license plate that read FATA, a personalized touch that made her car distinctive and easy to identify. She drove south from Charlotte toward Columbia, retracing the familiar route she had traveled many times over the previous 3 months. The drive would have taken her about 90 minutes depending on traffic. Interstate 77 cutting south through the Carolinas. Nikki arrived at Teddy Manning's home in Gadsden, a community in South Carolina, around 9 in the morning. His residence was on Bluff Road. According to what Teddy would later tell investigators, Nikki's purpose in coming was to have a conversation about their relationship. What exactly was said between them in those morning hours, we cannot know with complete certainty. But we know the general substance of the conversation. Nikki wanted more from the relationship. She wanted commitment, exclusivity, the things that people typically want when they're looking for a genuine partnership. Teddy, on the other hand, maintained that he only wanted something casual, that he wasn't interested in the kind of relationship Nikki was seeking. There was the matter of the jewelry as well. Nikki wanted it back. This was part of the reason for her visit, to collect her belongings and make a clean break. The conversation by all accounts became an argument. Emotions ran high. Two people wanting fundamentally different things, realizing that there was no path forward that would satisfy them both. At some point around mid-morning, at approximately 11:45, Nikki used her phone to call friends back in Charlotte. She told them she needed gas to get back home. This detail is important. It tells us that at 11:45, Nikki was alive and planning to return to Charlotte. She was looking ahead to the drive home. But Nikki McFadder would never make that drive. What happened after that phone call is a matter of evidence, testimony, and conflicting accounts that would be scrutinized in a courtroom more than a year later. But the basic facts are undeniable. Theodore Manning shot Nikki McFadder in the back of the head in an upstairs room of his home. The fatal wound came from a bullet that entered her skull from behind, traveling forward and upward. This detail, the trajectory of the bullet, would become important later when investigators tried to reconcile Teddy's various explanations of what happened. According to what Teddy would eventually tell police, after changing his story multiple times, he and Nikki had gotten into a fight. He claimed that Nikki had found his handgun and picked it up, that he wrestled it away from her, that in the struggle the gun went off. But the physical evidence, the location of the wound, the trajectory of the bullet, didn't support this version of events. Eventually, after continued questioning, Teddy Manning admitted something different. He admitted that he had intentionally pulled the trigger, that he meant to kill Nikki McFadder. After shooting Nikki, Teddy Manning faced a choice. He could call the police, report what had happened, face the immediate consequences of his actions, or he could try to make the problem disappear. He chose the latter. Teddy picked up his phone and called someone, another woman in his life. Her name was Kendra Danette Goodman. She was 27 years old, a single mother of two, and like Nikki, she was one of the women Teddy was seeing. In his world, in the way he had structured his romantic life, women were fungible, interchangeable. They were people he kept in rotation, calling them when he wanted company, keeping them at arm's length, emotionally. When Kendra arrived at Teddy's home on Bluff Road, she found him working on a black Honda. According to her later testimony, Teddy told her the car belonged to a friend and asked if she would follow him while he drove it to return it to its owner, then give him a ride back home. It was a simple request, the kind of favor one might ask of an acquaintance. What Kendra claimed she didn't know, at least not at that moment, was that Nikki McFadder's body was in the trunk of that black Honda. They left Teddy's home with Teddy driving Nikki's car and Kendra following behind in her gold Chevrolet Lumina. Their destination was a remote area in Fairfield County off Peach Road near Interstate 77. They pulled into the parking lot of a church, Calvary Church. Kendra waited there while Teddy continued down an adjacent dirt road, driving Nikki's Honda deeper into the woods, away from the main road, away from casual observation. When Teddy returned, he was on foot. He got into Kendra's car, and together they drove to a gas station on Bleathwood Road. There they purchased beer and gasoline. Then they returned to Peach Road, back to that church parking lot. This time, Teddy got out of the car carrying the gas can and Kendra's cigarette lighter. He walked away, back down that dirt road into the woods where he had left Nikki's car. Kendra waited. Then she heard it, an explosion. The sound carried across the distance, unmistakable. When Teddy returned to her car, he smelled like gasoline. The scent would have been overwhelming, clinging to his clothes, his skin. What Kendra said she didn't realize at the time was that Teddy had just set fire to Nikki McFadder's car with Nikki's body still inside the trunk. The explosion she heard was the culmination of his attempt to destroy evidence, to make Nikki disappear. But they weren't finished. Next came a stop at an ATM on Farrell Road. Using Nikki's debit card, they withdrew $500 from her bank account. Surveillance cameras at the ATM captured images of this transaction. The footage would later become a crucial piece of evidence. It showed a man using the card, and investigators would later determine that the car visible in the video, a gold Chevrolet Lumina, matched the description of Kendra's vehicle. After withdrawing the money, they returned to Teddy's home on Bluff Road. Kendra went to her own home. Teddy went to work at the power plant, as if it were a normal day. And according to what both would later admit to investigators, at some point that day, after Nikki McFadder had been shot, after her body had been placed in her car, after that car had been set on fire, Teddy Manning and Kendra Goodman had sex. The following day, May 7th, Teddy and Kendra made another purchase together. They went to a Walmart and bought bleach. Then they set about trying to clean up the evidence of what had happened in that upstairs room at Teddy's house. Back in Charlotte, people were starting to worry. When Nikki didn't show up for her shift at the airport, it set off alarm bells. Nikki was reliable. She didn't miss work without explanation. Her sister LaToya, living outside Raleigh, grew increasingly concerned when she couldn't reach Nikki. Nikki had told her about the plan to drive to Columbia, to end things with Teddy, to get her jewelry back. But now she wasn't answering her phone. On May 11th, 5 days after Nikki had driven to Columbia, LaToya reported her sister missing to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. Investigators immediately suspected that something was wrong. They knew Nikki had traveled to Columbia. They worried she hadn't made it back. The question was what had happened to her during that trip. The first place they needed to look was obvious. Nikki had told her sister she was going to see Teddy, so investigators made their way to Theodore Manning's home to question him. Initially, Teddy tried to downplay the relationship. He told investigators that he and Nikki were just friends with benefits, nothing serious, nothing that would explain why she might have gone missing. He admitted she had visited him on May 6th, but said she left that afternoon and he hadn't heard from her since. But investigators were thorough. They checked bank records and discovered something interesting. On May 6th, Nikki's ATM card had been used at a location in South Carolina. Someone had withdrawn money from her account after she was last heard from. They obtained a search warrant for Teddy's home and executed it on May 22nd, more than 2 weeks after Nikki's disappearance. Inside, they found receipts for cleaning supplies, including bleach, purchased on May 7th, the day after Nikki had gone missing. When asked about the bleach, Teddy said it was for a woman he knew. He gave them her name, Kendra Goodman. Investigators went to talk to Kendra, and they noticed something immediately. She drove a gold Chevrolet Lumina. It was the same type of vehicle that appeared in the surveillance footage from the ATM where Nikki's card had been used. At first, Kendra stuck to a story. She said the cleaning supplies were for her. She claimed she knew nothing about Nikki McFadder, but she also admitted that she had a casual relationship with Teddy, that she was another one of his friends with benefits. Investigators weren't convinced. They asked Kendra to take a polygraph test. She agreed, doing so without a lawyer present. The test indicated deception. When pressed harder, confronted with the inconsistencies in her account, Kendra's story began to change. She started talking, and what she told them led investigators to a remote wooded area off Peach Road in Fairfield County. On May 29, 2009, 3 weeks after Nikki McFadder had driven to Columbia to end her relationship with Teddy Manning, investigators found her car. It was in the woods, down a dirt road, exactly where Kendra had described. The black Honda Accord was completely burned. The fire had been so intense that the rims of the wheels had melted. The vehicle was barely recognizable. Inside the trunk, they found human remains. Charred, skeletal remains that would later be identified through dental records as belonging to Nikki McFadder. The forensic examination revealed the cause of death. Nikki had been shot once in the back of the head. Bullet fragments recovered from her skull were consistent with a high-point .380 caliber handgun. This matched the type of gun that Theodore Manning had purchased. Within 30 minutes of finding the car and Nikki's remains, investigators obtained a warrant for Teddy Manning's arrest. They went to his home on Bluff Road and took him into custody at 7:04 p.m. on May 29. The evidence against him was substantial. There was Nikki's blood on the wall of his bedroom. There were the surveillance images of him using her ATM card. There were the receipts for bleach purchased the day after the murder. There was Kendra's testimony about what had happened that day. There were his own statements to police, which had shifted and changed multiple times as investigators confronted him with evidence. Kendra Goodman was also arrested and charged as an accessory after the fact. Prosecutors believed she knew what Teddy had done and helped him cover it up, helping to clean the crime scene and dispose of evidence. The trial of Theodore Manning began in October of 2010, more than a year after Nikki's death. It took place at the Richland County Courthouse in Columbia. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They argued that Teddy Manning had deliberately murdered Nikki McFadder, then engaged in an elaborate cover-up with the help of Kendra Goodman. They presented the physical evidence, the surveillance footage, the testimony of investigators who had worked the case. Kendra Goodman took the stand to testify against Teddy. She admitted she had lied to police 4 times during initial questioning. She said Teddy had coached her on what to say, but now, she told the court, she was telling the truth. She described following Teddy to Peach Road, waiting in the church parking lot, hearing the explosion, smelling gasoline on him when he returned. She said she was testifying because Nikki's family deserved to know the truth and needed closure. The defense's strategy was to argue self-defense. Teddy took the stand in his own defense, something defendants don't always do because it exposes them to cross-examination. He testified that the shooting was an accident, that Nikki had found his gun and picked it up, that he wrestled it away from her, and that during the struggle the gun went off. But the prosecution hammered at the inconsistencies. If it was self-defense, why had he tried to hide the body? Why had he burned the car? Why had he used Nikki's ATM card? Why had he purchased bleach to clean up the crime scene? Why had he lied to investigators multiple times? And there was the physical evidence. The bullet wound in the back of Nikki's head. The trajectory of the bullet, traveling forward and upward. How did that match with Teddy's story of a struggle over the gun? The trial lasted into a second week. Witnesses testified. Evidence was presented. The jury heard recordings of Teddy's police interviews, listened to him change his story as investigators confronted him with facts. Finally, the case went to the jury. They had to decide, was this murder? Was it voluntary manslaughter? Or was it, as the defense claimed, self-defense? After deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Theodore Manning guilty of voluntary manslaughter, not murder, as the prosecution had hoped, not self-defense, as the defense had argued, but something in between, a finding that the killing had occurred in the heat of passion, during a heated argument, but without the premeditation required for a murder conviction. The judge sentenced Teddy Manning to 30 years in prison, the maximum sentence for voluntary manslaughter. Kendra Goodman, who had cooperated with prosecutors and testified against Teddy, was found guilty of being an accessory after the fact. She served approximately 2 years in prison. For Nikki McFadder's family and friends, the verdict was disappointing. They believed Teddy deserved to be convicted of murder, to face life in prison. 30 years seemed insufficient for what he had done. Theodore Manning is currently incarcerated at Lee Correctional Institution in Bishopville, South Carolina. According to prison records, he will be eligible for release in 2034, 25 years after Nikki McFadder's death. As for Kendra Goodman, After serving her brief sentence, she returned to civilian life. Her role in the case remains controversial. Some believe she was genuinely unaware of what Teddy had done until after the fact, that she was manipulated and frightened into helping him. Others believe her involvement was more knowing, more willing than she later claimed. What we do know is that Nikki McFadder's death revealed something troubling about Theodore Manning's past. During the trial, information emerged about his history. In August of 2008, about 10 months before he met Nikki, Manning had been charged with criminal domestic violence in the first degree. He had grabbed a 22-year-old woman he had been living with around the neck and choked her. This was the pattern of behavior that had existed before Nikki entered his life, a pattern of violence toward women. Nikki's sister LaToya and her friends, particularly a friend named Fran Eddings, worked hard to keep Nikki's memory alive and to make sure the facts of the case remained in the public eye. They wanted people to remember Nikki as more than just a victim. They wanted her remembered as the goal-oriented Navy veteran, the adventurous skydiver, the young woman working at the airport, trying to build a life for herself. The story of Nikki McFadder is, at its heart, a story about trust misplaced. She met someone online who seemed at first glance like a potential partner, someone with a similar background, similar age, someone who had also served in the military and was building a civilian life. But profiles on dating websites don't reveal everything. They don't show you someone's capacity for violence. They don't tell you about past relationships that ended with police intervention. They don't reveal that the person on the other end of those messages sees relationships as casual, transactional, something to be managed and controlled. Nikki McFadder drove to Colombia on May 6, 2009, to end a relationship that wasn't working, and to retrieve her belongings. It was a reasonable thing to do, the kind of thing people do all the time when relationships end. She had no way of knowing that Theodore Manning would respond the way he did. Sometimes in true crime, we look for lessons, for warnings, for ways to protect ourselves from similar fates, but the truth is that violence in relationships is notoriously difficult to predict. People who commit acts of domestic violence don't always show obvious signs beforehand. They can be charming, charismatic, seemingly normal. The violence emerges in moments of conflict, when control is threatened, when someone decides to leave. What happened to Nikki McFadder in that upstairs room in Theodore Manning's home on Bluff Road happened quickly. One moment she was planning her drive back to Charlotte. The next moment, her life was over. She was 30 years old. She had served her country. She had a job she showed up for reliably. She had friends and family who cared about her. She liked to jump out of airplanes on weekends, feeling the rush of freefall before pulling the ripcord and drifting safely back to Earth. All of that ended because Theodore Manning made a choice to pull the trigger, a choice to prioritize his own desire to avoid consequences over another human being's life, a choice to spend the hours after her death not turning himself in, not calling for help, but trying to erase evidence, to make Nikki disappear. But Nikki McFadder didn't disappear. Her sister reported her missing. Investigators searched for her. They found her remains. They built a case. They brought charges, and Theodore Manning was convicted and sent to prison. It wasn't the outcome Nikki's family hoped for. They wanted a murder conviction, wanted life in prison, but it was accountability of a sort. It was a recognition that what Theodore Manning did was wrong, was criminal, was deserving of punishment. If you're still awake and listening, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we journey together through a story that reminds us how precious life is, how fragile our moments can be. This is a story of a young woman full of promise, a family's unimaginable loss, and the long road to justice. The lights of Salt Lake City shimmer against the mountain darkness like stars that have fallen to earth. It's a city of contrasts, ancient peaks watching over modern streets, desert heat giving way to alpine cold. On any given night, planes descend into the valley, carrying people home, carrying them to new beginnings, carrying them toward moments that will define the rest of their lives. On the 17th of June, 2019, in the deepest hours of the early morning, one such plane touched down at Salt Lake City International Airport. Among its passengers was a 23-year-old woman named Mackenzie Luke. She was returning from California, from her grandmother's funeral, from saying goodbye to a woman she had loved deeply. Mackenzie had no way of knowing that within hours, she herself would be gone, that her own family would soon be searching, hoping, praying for any sign of her, that her name would become known not for the life she lived, but for the way it ended. But before we arrive at that dark conclusion, let us begin where all stories must begin. At the beginning, with a girl who loved the ocean, with a young woman building a future, with Mackenzie. Mackenzie Speth Luke was born on the 8th of March, 1996, in the coastal community of El Segundo, California. It's a small city tucked into Los Angeles County, where the scent of salt air mingles with the hum of nearby LAX airport. If you've ever driven along the Pacific Coast Highway, you've passed near the place where Mackenzie grew up, a place of beaches and sunshine, of palm trees swaying against impossibly blue skies. She was not an only child. Mackenzie had 3 brothers, one older, 2 younger, and together they formed the kind of close-knit unit that Southern California childhoods often create. Her parents, Gregory and Diana Luke, built a life centered around their children. Gregory worked in healthcare logistics and administration, while Diana devoted herself to raising their family. They were, by all accounts, good people, the kind of parents who attend every swim meet, who take photos at every milestone, who believe their daughter can accomplish anything she sets her mind to. And Mackenzie did set her mind to many things. At El Segundo High School, she joined the swim team. She played water polo, spending countless hours in chlorinated pools, learning the discipline of competition, the joy of teamwork. Her friends remember her as outgoing, positive, a young woman who lit up rooms simply by entering them. She had that quality some people do, of making others feel seen, heard, important. But Mackenzie was also a girl who loved solitude. She would ride her bike to the Pacific Ocean, would sit on the sand and watch the waves roll in, endless and eternal. There's something about the ocean that calls to certain souls. Maybe it's the vastness, maybe it's the rhythm, maybe it's the reminder that we are small, and the world is large, and there is beauty in both. When it came time for college, Mackenzie made a decision that surprised some who knew her. She chose to attend the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, 700 miles from home, far from the ocean she loved, far from her family's embrace. She wanted to study kinesiology and pre-nursing, following in her father's footsteps toward a career in healthcare. She wanted to help people, to make a difference, to do something meaningful. At the University of Utah, Mackenzie threw herself into campus life. She joined Alpha Chi Omega, a sorority that became her home away from home. In the sorority system, older members serve as mentors called bigs, to newer members called littles. Mackenzie was matched with a big named Carly Riley, and the two formed an instant connection. Riley would later say she was drawn to Mackenzie's outgoing personality, her positive energy, her zest for life. Mackenzie and her sorority sisters attended University of Utah football games together, cheering from the MS student section, their voices joining thousands of others in support of the Utes. She made friends easily. Kennedy Stoner, one of her closest companions, would remember how Mackenzie balanced everything: School, work, sorority life. She worked as a personal assistant to a family. Later, she took a job at a biological testing laboratory in Salt Lake City. She was responsible, driven, checking off all the boxes that define adult success. But Salt Lake City was not the ocean. On warm desert days, Mackenzie would recreate her California childhood in her own way, putting on a bikini, basking in the high-altitude sunshine, soaking in warmth and light. She missed the beach, missed her family, but she was building something here. A life, a future, a self. She called her friends Kenzie, not Mackenzie. She expressed feminist opinions. She registered with a third political party, thinking for herself about the world and her place in it. She was 23 years old, a part-time senior because she sometimes reduced her course load to work, because she was financially independent, because she was doing it all on her own terms. She was about to graduate, about to step into the career she had been preparing for, about to become whoever she was going to become. And then her grandmother died. June of 2019. Mackenzie's grandmother, the woman she called Papa Jerry, passed away. Mackenzie was devastated. She had posted on social media about her grandmother being a hero to many, selfless and perfect, a woman Mackenzie never imagined losing. But heaven, she wrote, couldn't wait for her. Mackenzie flew home to California for the funeral. It's one of those weekends that exists outside of normal time. Grief has a way of bending hours, making minutes stretch and compress in equal measure. She spent time with her family, with her cousins. One cousin, Chloe Stevens, would later remember swimming in their grandmother's backyard pool that weekend, the way they had done every summer since childhood. It was the last time Chloe saw Mackenzie alive, the last time she hugged her. She would replay those final moments over and over, wishing she could hold on just a little longer. But Mackenzie had to return to Utah. She had school, had work, had a life waiting for her 700 miles away. On the evening of June 16th, she boarded a red-eye flight back to Salt Lake City. The plane took off into the California night, climbed above the Pacific, traced the familiar path over deserts and mountains. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on June 17th, the plane touched down at Salt Lake City International Airport. Mackenzie gathered her luggage and texted her mother, landed, then, love you mama. Simple messages, the kind adult children send to let their parents know they're safe. Diana Luke received these texts and felt the relief every parent feels when their child arrives home safely. But when Diana tried to respond shortly afterward, she noticed something strange. Mackenzie's phone was off, turned off or dead, or something. Diana tried not to worry. Kids forget to charge their phones. Kids fall asleep. There's always an explanation. Mackenzie exited the airport into the mountain darkness. She ordered a Lyft, that modern convenience that has replaced taxis in our phone-centered world. The driver accepted the ride, pulled up to the terminal, helped Mackenzie load her luggage. She gave him an address, Hatch Park in North Salt Lake. Now this is where the story takes its first strange turn. Hatch Park was not Mackenzie's home. It was not her apartment, not her sorority house, not anywhere she lived. It was a public park about 8 miles from where she was staying. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the Lyft driver would later tell police that during the ride, Mackenzie seemed normal, not distressed, not frightened. She told him she was meeting a friend. When they arrived at Hatch Park, a dark, empty space at that hour, just a parking lot and grass and trees, someone was waiting. The driver saw another car. He saw a person. He helped Mackenzie transfer her luggage from his vehicle to this other vehicle. Mackenzie didn't seem upset. She appeared to know this person. She got into their car willingly. The Lyft driver completed his ride, collected his fare, drove away into the night. He had no reason to think anything was wrong. People meet friends in strange places all the time. Who was he to judge? At 2:58 in the morning, Mackenzie sent a text from her phone. 1 minute later, at 2:59, her phone was turned off. It would never be turned on again. Gregory Luke tried to call his daughter the next day. No answer. He tried again. Voicemail. He sent texts. Nothing. This was unusual. Mackenzie was good about staying in touch with her parents. They had an understanding, the kind many families have, check-ins, regular communication, the small threads that bind people across distance. When she didn't respond, Gregory felt a cold seed of worry plant itself in his chest. Diana tried too. More calls, more texts, all going into a void where their daughter used to be. They told themselves stories the way we do when fear creeps in. Maybe her phone died. Maybe she lost her charger. Maybe she's just busy with classes, with work, with life. Young people get distracted. It doesn't mean something's wrong. But the hours became days. June 17th became June 18th, then 19th. Mackenzie missed her midterm exams. She didn't show up for work. Friends started calling the Luke family, asking if they'd heard from her. Mackenzie was supposed to attend a wedding. She missed it. She had a cat in her apartment that needed feeding. The cat went hungry. Finally, on June 20th, 4 days after Mackenzie had last been seen, Gregory Luke called 911. His voice on the recording carries the weight every parent fears, the moment when worry transforms into something darker. "I'd like to get, if possible, a wellness check done on my daughter," he said. The Salt Lake City Police Department opened a missing persons case. They started with the basics. When was she last seen? Who saw her last? Where did she go? The Lyft driver's account gave them a starting point. Hatch Park, 3 a.m. Someone in another car. Detectives began reconstructing Mackenzie's digital footprint. In 2019, we all leave trails, texts, social media posts, app usage, location data. The police obtained records from Mackenzie's phone, her social media accounts, her email. What they found painted a picture of a young woman's life, but also revealed something her parents didn't know. Mackenzie used dating apps, several of them. Tinder, an app called Seeking Arrangement, another called Call Her Daddy. These platforms serve different purposes, some for casual dating, some for more specific arrangements. Seeking Arrangement in particular bills itself as a place where sugar daddies meet sugar babies, wealthy older men who provide financial support to younger women in exchange for companionship and often intimacy. Mackenzie had multiple arrangements like this. She had advised other women on how to use apps like Tinder to find sugar daddies. She had a separate credit card her father didn't know about, a separate bank account. This was part of her life she kept private, her method of supporting herself financially while pursuing her education. There's no judgment in these facts, only acknowledgement. Many young people navigate the expensive reality of college through unconventional means. What matters is that this online presence gave investigators a lead. On June 22nd, police discovered that Mackenzie had been using TextMe, a third-party messaging application. Her last communications on June 17th had been through this app. Detectives obtained IP address information for the number she'd been texting. They traced it back to a man named Ayoola Ajayi. His name was now written in the case file, and the investigators began to dig. Ayoola Adisa Ajayi was 31 years old. Born in Nigeria in 1988, he had immigrated to the United States and held a green card that allowed him to work and live legally in the country. He had studied computer science at Utah State University, though he never graduated. There were problems during his time there, issues with his visa, allegations that he'd stolen an iPad. He was barred from campus in 2012, allowed to return in 2015 after resolving his visa problems. He worked in information technology, bouncing between various tech support positions. He had briefly served in the Army National Guard. On paper he appeared to be an ordinary person, someone trying to build a life, someone navigating the complexities of immigration and employment, an American existence. But there were shadows in his history. In March of 2018, Ayula had invited a woman he'd met on a dating app to his home for dinner. While they watched television on his couch, he began kissing her intensely, trying to touch her inappropriately. When she resisted, when she tried to get away, he pinned her down. He bit her, multiple times, hard enough to leave significant bruising and marks. The woman escaped, but she didn't initially report the assault. There was also a rape investigation in 2014 connected to Ayula, though the alleged victim didn't pursue charges. His ex-wife claimed he would become aggressive when she didn't comply with his demands, that he had threatened to have someone kidnap and kill her. She cut off all communication with him. And then there was the book. In April of 2019, just 2 months before Mackenzie disappeared, Ayula had self-published a novel on Amazon called Forge Identity. The protagonist is a teenager named Ezekiel, who must choose between joining a criminal mastermind or fighting to escape tyranny. In the book, 2 characters are killed and burned. Ayula also rented out rooms in his home as Airbnb listings. In April of 2019, he approached a contractor with an unusual request. He wanted a secret soundproofed room built under his front porch, with head-height hooks on the wall, and a fingerprint scanner for entry. The contractor found the request strange but didn't report it. According to prosecutors, Ayula and Mackenzie had met on seeking arrangement in 2018. They had communicated sporadically since then. On June 17, 2019, they arranged to meet after Mackenzie returned from California. On June 22nd, 5 days after Mackenzie disappeared, Salt Lake City police went to Ayula Ajayi's house. He lived at 547 North 1000 West in Salt Lake City's Fair Park neighborhood, a modest home where he lived and ran his Airbnb business. Detectives knocked on his door. Ayula answered. When they asked if he knew Mackenzie Lewick, if he had ever seen her, he said no. He claimed he didn't recognize her photo, but when they asked about his internet connection and the IP address traced to his house, he said he left his Wi-Fi open to the public because of his Airbnb guests. Someone else must have used it, he suggested. Police showed him his phone. They asked about seeking arrangement, the app installed on his device. Ayula was evasive, but agreed to let them look through some of his records. The detectives left, but they kept investigating. Phone records told a story Ayula wasn't telling. The data showed that both Mackenzie's phone and Ayula's phone had been at Hatch Park within less than 1 minute of each other at approximately 3 a.m. On June 17th. Both phones had then traveled to Ayula's address. Mackenzie's phone was turned off. Ayula's phone was turned off when he arrived back at his house, unusual behavior for someone who claimed he was never there. On June 26th, 9 days after Mackenzie vanished, police obtained a search warrant for Ayula's property. They brought a cadaver dog, a dog specially trained to detect the scent of human remains. The dog was led into Ayula's backyard. Almost immediately, the dog indicated on a disturbed area of earth near the back of the property. Neighbors had noticed something strange in the days after June 17th. They had seen Ayula burning something in his backyard, a large fire, unusual and troubling. One neighbor, a woman, had yelled at him to put it out or she would call the fire department. The fire was so intense, so out of place in a residential neighborhood, that it alarmed multiple people. A man who was renting Ayula's basement through Airbnb witnessed some of this. He told police that on the morning of June 17th, Ayula had asked him to go to Smith's grocery store. They went together. Ayula purchased a gas can. They went to a gas station and filled the can. When they returned to the house, the renter took a shower. When he came back outside, there was a fire burning in the backyard, pallets stacked against the fence, a white door, all engulfed in flames. Ayula claimed he was just burning trash because his garbage cans were full. The renter, who was from Texas, told Ayula this wouldn't be allowed where he came from, but he didn't call the police. He didn't want to get involved. Now with the search warrant, with the cadaver dog indicating on that spot in the backyard, investigators began to dig. They found human bone, charred muscular tissue, part of a scalp with hair still attached. A cell phone melted, destroyed, but identifiable. Personal items burned beyond recognition. DNA testing confirmed what the investigators already suspected in their hearts. These were Mackenzie Luke's remains. But this was only part of her. Where was the rest? On June 28th, 11 days after Mackenzie disappeared, police arrested Ayula Ajayi. He was charged with aggravated murder, aggravated kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and desecration of a human body. During subsequent interrogation at the police station, while his house was being searched, Ayula acted confused, distressed. He asked why he was being questioned. "This is terrible," he said. "I just want this to be over." When detectives pressed him, he began to hyperventilate. Medics were called to assess him, to help him control his breathing. He appeared cooperative, offering passwords to his phones and laptops, access to his security system, but he denied everything. He claimed he and Mackenzie had never met in person. He said it would be weird to meet at that time of night, that it wouldn't be safe for either of them. He suggested that maybe Mackenzie had stopped responding to his messages after he sent her a picture showing he was black, implying racial prejudice on her part, attempting to deflect blame. The security footage from his house told a different story. The system showed that on June 17th, in the hours before he left to meet Mackenzie at Hatch Park, Ayula had deliberately turned off his security cameras. He didn't want any video evidence of Mackenzie being at his house. And there was more to find. Ayula's phone records showed that after June 17th, his phone had pinged in Logan Canyon, a remote mountainous area, 85 miles north of Salt Lake City. On July 3rd, nearly 2 weeks after Mackenzie was last seen alive, police searched Logan Canyon based on this phone data. In a shallow grave in a wooded area, covered with brush, they found the rest of Mackenzie Luke. Her body was charred from fire. Her arms were bound behind her back with a zip tie and rope. She had suffered blunt force trauma to the left side of her skull, a hole where part of her skull and scalp were missing. An autopsy would later determine that this trauma caused brain hemorrhaging. She had also been strangled. The medical examiner concluded that Mackenzie died from the blunt force trauma and strangulation, but the precise sequence of events, what happened first, what happened last, only one person truly knew. For more than a year, the case moved through the criminal justice system. Ayula Ajayi was held without bail. Evidence was compiled. The prosecution prepared for trial, including the possibility of seeking the death penalty. More victims came forward. The woman he had assaulted in March 2018 finally reported what happened to her when she saw news coverage of Mackenzie's death. During the investigation, police also found child pornography on Ayula's computer, 19 images depicting children between the ages of 4 and 8. Additional charges were filed. Then, in October of 2020, Ayula made a decision. Rather than face trial and the possibility of execution, he agreed to plead guilty. His defense attorney, Neil Hamilton, stood in court and spoke the words that gave Mackenzie's family some measure of truth, if not peace. Mr. Ajayi had decided that he would murder Miss Luke before the meeting took place. Hamilton said, the murder was planned, premeditated. Before Ayula ever left his house to meet Mackenzie at Hatch Park, he had already decided she would die. Hamilton explained what happened after Mackenzie got into Ayula's car at the park. They drove to his house in the Fair Park neighborhood. Once inside, Ayula tied Mackenzie's hands behind her back with zip ties and rope. He began to choke her with his hand. Mackenzie protested. She told him to stop. He didn't stop. He moved her onto her stomach and continued strangling her with a belt until she stopped moving, until she stopped breathing, until her heart stopped beating. Then he burned her body in his backyard, the fire his neighbors saw, the fire that had alarmed the Airbnb renter, the fire that consumed flesh and bone. He attempted to destroy the evidence of what he'd done. When that proved insufficient, when he realized the police were investigating, he moved what remained of Mackenzie's body to Logan Canyon, 85 miles away, and buried her in a shallow grave. Why? The district attorney said there was no clear motive, no profit motive, no obvious anger, nothing that made sense to ordinary minds trying to understand extraordinary evil. There isn't one here, Singill said, other than murder for murder's sake. In exchange for his guilty plea to aggravated murder and desecration of a human body, Ayula Ajayi was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He also pleaded guilty to forcible sexual abuse in connection with the March 2018 assault on the other woman. The child pornography charges were dropped as part of the plea agreement, though their existence remained part of the public record. On October 23, 2020, Ayula Ajayi stood in a courtroom, wearing an orange jumpsuit, glasses and a blue surgical mask. This was during the pandemic, when even grief and justice had to be conducted through barriers and distance. The courtroom was nearly empty due to COVID restrictions. Only Mackenzie's family, the attorneys and the judge were allowed inside. Everyone else watched via live stream. Mackenzie's family took turns speaking. Their words carried the weight of 16 months of anguish, of questions without answers, of nights wondering if their daughter had suffered, if she had been afraid, if she had called out for them. Diana Luke, Mackenzie's mother, described her daughter as kind, loving, caring, a true spitfire. She said the sentence would not bring Mackenzie back, but she hoped it would keep Ayula out of the public eye, unable to commit these heinous crimes again. Gregory Luke, Mackenzie's father, was angrier. He looked at the man who had murdered his only daughter, and said he hoped Ayula would spend the rest of his life in isolation. He said he looked forward to the call from Utah officials informing him that Ayula had died. "I can only hope that it will be a slow, painful death," Gregory said. He added that he had no compassion for Ayula, because Ayula had shown no compassion toward Mackenzie. "I'm not sure you even have anything to look forward to in the afterlife," he said, "if you believe in that." The father spoke of what would never be. "My daughter Mackenzie Luke was a sweet, amazing young lady with the world ahead of her. She was a kind-hearted person that cared about others. Now, I will not have the opportunity to see her blossom in life. They would never see her graduate from college, never see her start her nursing career, never see her get married, never hold her children, never watch her become whoever she was supposed to become. All those possible futures, all those unlived moments gone, erased by one man's decision to take what was not his to take." Mackenzie's cousin Carly Stevens spoke through tears. "This is a nightmare you can't wake up from. I will never be able to forgive what happened to her. I will never forgive the monster who took her life. Never in my life have I felt anger the way I have the last 16 months. Never have I been so fearful for my life, because I know how real evil is in this world." Another cousin, Chloe Stevens, remembered those last moments at their grandmother's pool. "I replay those final moments together in my head over and over, stricken with grief that I cannot somehow keep her with us just a little bit longer. The pain of Kenzie's loss, and the permanent fracture it has left in our family, is indescribable. It haunts me daily that I was not able to protect her. When it was his turn to speak, Ayula Ajayi hung his head. His voice muffled by his mask, he said, "I'm sorry for what I did. I deserve what I'm going to get. I know this won't bring her back." District Attorney Sim Gill told the media afterward that he didn't believe the apology was genuine. The judge, Vernice Trees, sentenced Ayula to life in prison without parole for the murder, plus 1 to 5 years for desecrating Mackenzie's body, and 1 to 15 years for the sexual abuse of the other victim. She ordered the sentences to run consecutively, one after the other, which was largely symbolic given the life sentence, but she felt it important to acknowledge all of Ayula's victims, all of the harm he had caused. The Find Mackenzie Luke Facebook page, which had drawn thousands of followers during the search, was eventually taken down. The posters that had been hung throughout Salt Lake City were removed. Life, as it does, moved forward for everyone except Mackenzie. Her sorority sisters graduated. They started careers, got married, had children, all the things Mackenzie would have done. They think of her. They remember. Her family continues on, carrying a wound that will never fully heal. Gregory and Diana Luke still live in El Segundo, California, in the house where Mackenzie grew up, where her childhood bedroom sits exactly as she left it. Parents should never have to bury their children. It violates the natural order of things, the way we expect life to unfold. Ayula Ajayi is incarcerated in the Utah State Prison, where he will remain until he dies. He is in his mid-30s as of this recording. Statistically, he could live another 40 or 50 years behind bars. Every morning when he wakes up, every night when he goes to sleep, he is there, and Mackenzie is gone. Sometimes people ask why these stories matter. Why revisit such darkness? Why speak of these things at all? Perhaps because remembering is a form of resistance against erasure. Mackenzie Luke was not just a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a student, a co-worker, a sorority sister. She loved the ocean. She played water polo. She was building a life, making choices, becoming herself. She deserved to live that life fully, to make mistakes and have triumphs, to grow old and look back on her youth with wisdom and nostalgia. What was taken from her cannot be restored, but what remains, her story, her name, the love her family still carries, that cannot be taken. It endures. Rest softly now. Let the story settle in your mind like dust after a storm. Remember Mackenzie Luke. Remember that every life has value. Every person matters. Every moment is precious because we never know which moment will be our last. The night is deep. The world is sleeping. And somewhere, somehow, we hope that Mackenzie has found the peace that was stolen from her on that dark morning in June. May she rest in eternal light. May her family find comfort in knowing she is remembered. May we all hold our loved ones a little closer. May we cherish the ordinary moments that constitute a life. Thank you so much for spending your night with Midnight Crime Stories. I hope the stories kept you company and helped you drift a little closer to sleep. If you're still awake, leave a final comment. Tell me which story stood out to you the most tonight. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more calm, late-night true crime. Sleep well, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.